The first true cold of the Rockies doesn't arrive with drama. It slips in quietly, like a thief testing a latch in the dark. One late November evening, as the sun bled out behind the bitter granite peaks, Elias Rowan felt that thief enter his home. Not through the door, not through the chimney, but through the walls themselves, straight through solid pine logs that should have kept a man safe. He could sense it the way old mountain men do, not as a breeze, but as a weight, a pressure, a slow draining of warmth from the air around him. Elias had lived in the high country for nearly 30 winters. He'd trapped beaver when the trade was still alive, hunted elk when the herds were thick, slept under stars that froze his beard into needles. He understood cold. But this year, this winter of 1816, felt different. Sharper, hungrier. The kind of cold that made dogs whine in their sleep and made a man second-guess whether he'd stacked enough firewood, even if he had 5 cords drying under his shed. Inside the cabin, the fire roared, spitting sparks against the iron pot. Yet the air just 10 feet from the hearth felt heavy and sour with cold. Elias watched frost widen across the window glass like cracks in thin ice. He touched the north wall, expecting rough bark and steady warmth. Instead, the log bit back cold hard, almost stone-like. That's when he knew the cabin itself was losing the fight. It wasn't neglect.
Keeps the cold out.
Elias had built this home with the same skill every mountain man swore, by tight joins, good chinking thick logs cut from wind-stunted lodge poles. But the old belief that a good cabin keeps its own heat was proving wrong. Logs conducted the freeze straight inside. Tiny gaps he couldn't see funneled drafts down like invisible knives. By midnight, his breath hung in the air in long, ghostly clouds. His wife pulled their quilts closer around her shoulders. His youngest boy coughed from the loft, where cold sank like water. And as the fire sputtered low, Elias looked around the dim cabin and whispered to himself a whisper no one heard, but the timber and the dark outside. There has to be a better way. The old ways aren't enough anymore. That quiet moment of doubt, that single seed, would grow into the strangest, smartest, and most ridiculed idea the valley had ever seen. An idea that would make his cabin nearly 29 degrees warmer than any man believed possible. The first real warning didn't come from the cold outside. It came from a sound so small, so ordinary that most men wouldn't have noticed it at all, a faint tick like dry wood shifting under pressure. Elias Rowan paused at the chopping block, head tilted listening. The wind was rising from the north, funneling down the high ridges of the Bitterroot Range. He knew that wind. It was the kind that skinned a man's face and chewed its way through his clothes, as if cotton and wool were nothing more than polite suggestions. Inside the cabin, the air held a thinness he didn't like. Not exactly a drafts, whispered and moved. This was different. It felt as if the warmth itself were leaking away, being pulled through the walls, grain by grain. Elias shut the door behind him and felt along the north wall palm, gliding over the curvature of each log. One section felt wrong, too cold, too sharp. A narrow split had opened where 2 logs met no bigger than a knife blade. Yet it carried the breath of the entire mountain with it. He pressed his fingers into the gap. Frost had already formed in the inner crevice. Most settlers would have packed moss, pushed in clay, maybe muttered a curse as they moved on. Elias did all those things too. He stuffed the gap with lodgepole moss-smoothed river clay over the top and watched it hold for 2 days. Then the wind returned, and the clay cracked like a dry riverbed. By the end of the week, 3 more hairline splits appeared. Tiny wounds in the cabin's hide, yet each one leaked cold, as if the walls were bleeding heat.
What a joke.
The fire roared day and night, but warmth stayed clustered near the hearth, like an animal afraid to wander. 10 paces away, the air felt hollow. His wife wrapped her shoulders with a quilt even while cooking. His eldest boy complained that the loft felt as cold as the inside of a snowbank. Even the dog slept pressed against the stones of the fireplace base. Elias stood outside one dawn, watching the smoke rise straight up into a sky the color of old steel. The temperature had dropped to nearly 30 below. He touched the outer logs again. They felt like blocks of ice, solid, unforgiving, sucking warmth from the inside, the way a frozen creek bed drinks sunlight. That's when he understood something most frontier men never questioned. A log cabin wasn't a refuge. Not by itself. Not anymore. Not in winters like these. The problem wasn't the cracks. It was the walls themselves, great cylinders of wood acting as perfect bridges for the cold, conducting it inward, inch by inch. And if the walls were the enemy, he would need a new kind of defense, one no man in the valley had ever tried. Long before Elias Rowan ever built a cabin of his own, he had spent his younger years drifting through the northeastern forests, places where the Abenaki Métis voyageurs and old trappers understood the land in ways most settlers never bothered to learn. Those memories came back to him now, not as nostalgia, but as quiet, insistent reminders of things he'd witnessed without understanding at the time. He remembered one particular winter in his early 20s when he traveled with a French Métis trapper named Laurent Marchand. Laurent was older, sharp-eyed, and carried the kind of knowledge that isn't written in books, but whispered from father to son. They had taken shelter once, in a crude, earth-covered shelter, a dugout built by an Abenaki family generation earlier. The walls were logs, but the exterior was packed in thick, layered earth that looked more like a hillside than a house. Elias remembered brushing his hand against the wall that night and being struck by how neutral it felt. Not warm, not cold, just steady like the inside of a root cellar. Laurent had laughed when he saw Elias noticing it. La terre, elle respire, he had said. The earth it breathes. It keeps what it needs, gives what it must. Wood alone fights the winter. Earth ignores it. At the time, Elias didn't ask more. He was young, strong, and believed warmth meant more firewood and a bigger blaze. The simplicity of a fire appealed to a young man. The patience of earth did not. But now, standing in his own cold cabin 30 years later, those old memories rose like thawing river ice. That dugout had stayed warm with barely a hand-sized fire. The walls hadn't wept moisture. The air hadn't carried a bite. Even Laurent, who complained about everything, slept comfortably. And then another memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in decades. A Métis root cellar in the St. John Valley, its exterior coated with a thick mixture of clay, river silt, and straw. The old woman who maintained it swore it kept vegetables from freezing, even in the worst winters. Elias hadn't believed her then, but her words suddenly made sense. The principle wasn't magic. It was simple earth didn't let temperature swing wildly. It buffered, it slowed, it resisted, and unlike logs, straight conduits for cold earth was full of tiny voids, pockets of trapped air. Little secrets of insulation, older than the frontier itself. Elias stared again at his cabin walls. Bare wood, no matter how thick, would never outsmart a Rockies winter. But earth? Earth just might. An odd thought crept into his mind. Strange, half-formed, uncomfortable. What if the answer wasn't to fix the cabin, but to dress it in something older, something forgotten, something made of earth? Most men on the frontier understood cold only as an enemy, an adversary you fought with firewool and stubbornness. But Elias Rowan had lived long enough to realize the truth. Cold wasn't merely a force. It was a set of rules, a system, and systems can be understood, manipulated, even outsmarted. He sat beside the hearth one dim afternoon, watching the flames ripple gold against the cabin logs. The room was warm near the fire. But the edges, the corners, the loft, the north wall still felt like caves of shadowed frost. He stretched out his hand and moved it slowly through the air. Just 3 feet from the flames, the temperature collapsed. The warmth had no reach. It was losing a war it didn't even know it was fighting. Elias closed his eyes and pictured the cabin as he'd built it. Logs roughly 10 inches across, chinking between each gap, a steep roof to shed snow. All the markings of a good cabin by every settler's standards. But standards didn't keep you warm. Principles did. He recalled lessons learned from old craftsmen and trappers decades ago, simple truths that now click together like puzzle pieces. 1. Conduction the thief that moves in silence. Wood wasn't as insulating as people believed. 10 inches of pine acted like a chilled bridge between the world outside and the world inside. The cold didn't sneak through cracks. It marched boldly through the logs themselves, following the grain like a road map. 2. Convection and the invisible wind inside your home. Every tiny opening, even those too small to see, created airflow. Cold air didn't leak in. It was pulled in by warm air, rising, escaping through the roof, or chimney sucking cold behind it, like water chasing a receding tide. 3. Radiation, the cold that reaches without touching. Even a perfect wall radiated cold inward the same way a winter night radiated cold into a man's bones. Most settlers fought all 3 forces the same way. Burn more wood patch, more cracks, hope for the best. But Elias finally saw the flaw. He wasn't losing because the winter was stronger. He was losing because he was playing the wrong game. Logs alone couldn't stop conduction. Clay chinking couldn't stop convection. A roaring fire couldn't stop radiative loss. But earth, dense, heavy, full of air pockets, could interrupt all 3 at once. Earth didn't conduct cold quickly. Earth stores heat slowly. Earth seals air leaks naturally. As he stared at the cabin walls, an idea formed, not fully, not confidently, but with a strange, urgent logic. What if he wrapped the cabin, not in cloth, not in wood, but in the oldest insulator known to humankind, the earth itself? It sounded foolish. It sounded impractical. But the physics, the frontier physics, were undeniable. The land around him held the secret. All he had to do was trust it. The idea first arrived as a whisper, ridiculous, fragile, almost embarrassing to say out loud. Wrap the cabin in earth. Cover the entire structure, logs, and all in a second skin of soil, clay, and straw. Not a thin smear like chinking, but a real layer. 5, maybe 6 inches thick. An earthen coat for a wooden house. Elias sat with it for days, testing the thought the way a man tests a trap spring press, a little, pull a little, see if it holds. The more he pushed, the sturdier it felt. The more he compared it to the physics he understood in his bones, the more sense it made. Earth didn't let heat slip through its fingers. Earth didn't bow to the whims of wind. Earth simply existed, solid, heavy, patient. But the moment he pictured actually doing it, mixing mud like a child, making pies, plastering it over a cabin like some misguided prairie sculptor, he felt the heat rise in his cheeks. The valley was small. News traveled fast. Opinions traveled faster. And settlers, for all their grit, held tightly to their idea of what a proper frontier home should look like. So when he finally mentioned the concept to his neighbor, old Jed Harker, he did it casually, half joking, half measuring the reaction. Jed barked a laugh so loud it startled the mule in his yard. Cover your house in mud. Elias, have you been sniffing turpentine? You'll make the place look like a beaver lodge. Word spread by evening. The Rowan cabin, people said, was about to be turned into a mud hut. Some added that he'd lost his senses. Others claimed he must be desperate. One woman muttered that it was unnatural that homes should look like homes, not dirt mounds. On the frontier, ridicule carried real weight. A man could endure cold, hunger, coyotes, and loneliness, But being the valley's laughingstock, that cut deeper. And yet, every night the wind hammered the logs. Every morning frost clung to the inside walls. His youngest boy woke coughing. His wife's hands shook from the cold as she cooked. Mockery was painful, but watching his family shiver through another winter that was unbearable. So one crisp morning, with the ground beginning to harden and winter shadows lengthening across the meadow, Elias Rowan took a deep breath and made his choice. He would do the foolish thing, the ugly thing, the thing that made every man within 10 miles shake his head. He would coat his cabin in earth, even if the whole valley laughed until spring, because if the old ways failed, it was time to try something different. And survival, not pride, was the only measure that mattered. Once the decision was made, Elias Rowan moved with the steady determination of a man who had already burned his bridges. No turning back. No waiting for approval. Winter was coming fast, and every sunrise felt like borrowed time. The first step wasn't mud at all, it was wood. Thin, flexible, stubborn wood. Elias selected willow saplings from the creek bank, cutting them at shoulder length. Willow bent without breaking, a quality any trapper admired. Then he drove stout stakes into the ground, 6 inches from the cabin walls, spacing them 3 feet apart all the way around the cabin's perimeter. When finished, it looked as though the cabin were suddenly wearing an uneven picket fence. Next came the weaving. He threaded the willow branches horizontally between the stakes, creating a crude wattle screen, an airy skeleton that would eventually hold the weight of the mud. It rose slowly, row by row, until the woven lattice reached the eaves, encasing the cabin in what looked like a giant reed basket. Neighbors passing along the trails slowed their horses, shaking their heads. "Building a nest," Rowan, one man joked. "Looks like you're giving your home a ribcage," another added. Elias ignored them. A man with cold children doesn't have the luxury of pride. Only after the frame was done and secured did he turn to the earth itself. He hauled clay from a creek bend, heavy and sticky. He shoveled sandy soil from a dried floodplain. He chopped straw until his shoulders ached and his hands blistered. Then he mixed them 3 parts soil, 1 part clay, enough straw to give the mixture bite. When water was added, the mass came alive beneath his boots, thick and resistant like working dough for giants. His first batch failed. Too wet, it slumped off the wattle and pooled at his feet. The second batch dried too fast and cracked like a shattered plate. By the 5th attempt, he had the texture right, firm, sticky, slow drying. He pressed handfuls of mud into the wattle frame, beginning from the bottom, packing it tight so it wouldn't sag. Each press made a deep, satisfying sound, solid meeting solid. The first inch took hours. The first full wall took days. By evening, mud coated his arms, his shirt, even his beard. He looked less like a mountain man and more like something clawed up from an old riverbed. But for the first time in weeks, he felt hope. Layer by layer, inch by inch, he wasn't just covering a cabin. He was building a second wall, a barrier between his family and the winter that had nearly broken them. And he knew deep in his chest that if this mad idea worked, it would change everything. As October crept in, the mountains darkened earlier each evening, and the air took on that metallic smell that warned of coming snow. Elias Rowan felt the pressure of time like a hand on his back. The first layer of mud was only the beginning, barely a skin. To truly insulate the cabin, he needed inches of it, a slow, deliberate build-up that couldn't be rushed. He returned to the walls each morning while frost still painted the meadow, the mud cold beneath his palms. The first layer, a rough 2 inches, had begun to harden. Tiny straw fibers poked through its surface like whiskers. He tapped the surface with his knuckles. It held firm, not perfect, but strong enough to support the next layer. He mixed more earth, working barefoot in the mud pit to feel the consistency. The mixture needed to cling, but not slump breathe, but not crack. Every adjustment, another handful of straw, a scoop more clay. A splash of water made the work feel less like construction and more like cooking for survival. Every batch mattered. The second layer took longer. Mud had to be pressed deep enough to bind with the first, but not so aggressively that it tore the half-dry coating beneath. Elias worked upward, inch by inch, smoothing each handful with the side of his forearm. The process was hypnotic press-pull, smooth breathe. The wind carried the earthy scent of clay around the cabin like incense. His wife occasionally stepped outside offering water or a few minutes of company. His children watched from the edge of the yard, fascinated that their father was turning their home into a mound of earth. Once his daughter softly asked Will, "It'd still be our cabin after Papa?" Elias smiled. "More than before," he said. "It'll be a cabin that listens to the land." By the time he reached the third layer, the one that would complete the full 6-inch thickness, the cabin no longer resembled a log structure at all. The shape of the logs had vanished beneath a smooth, rounded form. From a distance, the house looked as though it had been carved from a single block of packed clay or grown from the soil itself. And with each inch added, the cabin's breath slowed. The drafts dwindled. The walls no longer felt icy to the touch. Even without a fire burning, Elias sensed something remarkable. The cabin's interior held warmth a little longer each day, as though it were beginning to wake up, learning to store and release heat the way Earth had always done. Layer by layer, strength built upon strength, the mud rising like a fortress wall against the winter to come. Elias had never seen a home like this on the frontier. But he was certain, absolutely certain, that no frontier winter had ever seen a home like this either. By early November, the transformation was undeniable. The Rowan cabin, once a tidy shape of notched lodgepole logs, now stood as something entirely different, something older, almost primordial. The sharp lines of wood had vanished beneath the new earthen skin. What remained was a rounded, solid structure, the color of riverbank clay, the straw within it, catching the morning sun like threads of gold. To the passing settler, it looked strange, uncomfortably strange. Frontier cabins were meant to be angular, honest in their construction, each log announcing itself plainly. This looked like a structure born from the land rather than built upon it. It had the silhouette of an adobe home from far to the south, or the curved mass of a Plains tribe earth lodge. Even its doorways looked deeper now, framed by 6 inches of recessed earth, giving the impression of a protected burrow rather than a wooden threshold. Elias stepped back one crisp morning to view the entire thing. For a long moment, he barely recognized what he had created. His neighbors certainly didn't. Jed Harker rode by, first his horse slowing as he stared. Lured above, he muttered Rowans, turned his cabin into a giant anthill. A pair of hunters stopped along the road later that afternoon, debating whether the cabin was collapsing or simply decaying. Others came on foot, shaking their heads, whispering about how far a man might drift from reason when the winters pushed him too hard. Behind closed doors, some claimed Elias was losing his frontier sense. One woman murmured that no decent home should look like dirt. But even as mockery drifted across the valley like smoke, something else lingered beneath it. Curiosity. People couldn't look away. The cabin had become an oddity, a riddle, a challenge to the assumptions settlers carried with them from the east. Frontier men were stubborn, but they were practical too. And practicality often started with watching the fool to see if he froze or thrived. Inside, the difference was already palpable. The walls no longer radiated cold. Touching them felt like touching stone that had been asleep for a century, cool, but steady, no longer bleeding temperature. The air held warmth longer after the fire died. Even silence inside the cabin had changed. Sounds felt softer, more muted, as though the earth had wrapped the home in a thick protective hush. Elias didn't care that it looked odd. He didn't care that the whole valley wagged their tongues. A home, he thought, it isn't measured by its beauty. It's measured by the life it protects. And winter, the real judge, was just over the ridge. The first test came sooner than expected. A brutal cold front swept down from the peaks one night, carried by a wind so sharp it seemed to scrape sparks off the stars. By dusk, the temperature had already plunged below zero. By midnight, it was 29 degrees below. Cold enough to silence the forest, freeze the creeks solid, and kill a man without mercy if he lingered outside too long. Elias Rowan lay awake in the dim cabin, staring at the beam above his head. He wasn't thinking about the wind. He wasn't thinking about the fire. He was thinking about the walls, those thick, earthen-coated walls that the entire valley had laughed at. Tonight would prove him right. Or prove him a fool. He finally rose, padded across the floor, and touched the inside wall. It didn't bite his hand. The logs, once frigid and hostile, now felt barely cool. More like the shaded side of a stone on a spring morning than the frozen cylinders they had been. The cold wasn't pouring through them anymore. It was being slowed, stalled, held back by the heavy, patient layer of earth. His fingertips tingled with disbelief. He moved to the center of the room, exhaled, and noticed something astonishing. His breath did not hang thick in the air. No lingering clouds. No ghostly condensation. He crossed to the hearth. The fire burned low, just a steady bed of coals, not the roaring blaze he once needed, simply to keep the room habitable. Yet the cabin felt warm. Not merely tolerable warm. A warmth that spread evenly, reaching the corners that used to hide shadows of frost. The loft above felt the same. Even the floorboards were gentler underfoot. Elias lifted the small brass thermometer he had bought years earlier in St. Louis. The needle hovered just above 60 degrees, 29 below outside, 61 inside. A 30-degree difference. A miracle by frontier standards. His wife stirred from her blankets. "The fire's barely going," she whispered. "Why is it so warm?" Elias couldn't help but smile. "It's the walls," he said softly. "They're finally doing their job." He stepped outside for a moment, braving the savage cold to inspect the mud layer. Under the moonlight, the coat looked almost alive. Solid, uncracked, firm as baked clay. Frost clung to its exterior, but inside the cabin held its warmth like a creature with a beating heart. The neighbors had called it foolish, ugly, pointless. But here, on the first brutal night of the Rockies' winter, Elias Rowan's strange earthen coat had done the impossible. It had given a wooden cabin the warmth of a deep, sleeping earth lodge. And winter, for the first time in years, felt like something a man could endure, not something he had to survive. In the days that followed, the Rowan cabin settled into a rhythm Elias had never experienced in any home he'd built, lived in, or wintered inside. For the first time in decades, warmth didn't feel like a visitor that had to be constantly entertained with wood and fire. It felt like a resident, quiet, steady, dependable. Every morning told the story more clearly. When Elias rose before dawn to tend the stove, the air inside the cabin was no longer bitter or biting. Gone were the mornings when frost clung to the inside of the windows like lace, or when you could see your breath long after the fire died. Instead, the cabin held a gentle warmth like a loaf of bread cooling after being taken from the oven. His children noticed first. The older boy, Thomas, bounded down from the loft one morning without shivering or clutching his blanket. The little one, Caleb, stopped coughing overnight, a cough that had haunted last winter, like an unwelcome house guest. Their cheeks were pink now, not pale. Their hands stayed warm, even while playing on the floorboards, where cold once lingered like a puddle. His wife, Margaret, began moving through the cabin with an ease Elias hadn't seen in years. She no longer cooked while wrapped in a shawl. Her hands no longer trembled from holding pots beside the fire. One evening, she stood near the window far from the stove and laughed softly. "I can't remember the last time I felt this warm indoors," she said. Her voice carried relief, gratitude, and something else Elias hadn't heard in a long while, comfort. The changes reached beyond in the family's bodies. They reached into their calendar, their chores, their lives. Elias suddenly had time he'd never had before. No longer chained to the axe and the woodshed, he wasn't cutting firewood from dawn to dusk. Last winter, he'd burned through piles of wood like a locomotive burns coal, always hungry, never satisfied. This year, the pile barely shrank. The small daily fire did far more than the roaring infernos of the past. Margaret began to keep the cabin cleaner, too. Without frost forming on the walls and melting midday, there was no constant dampness, no mildew creeping into corners, no icy drip from window frames. Everything felt drier, healthier, kinder. Even the silence felt better. Instead of the endless rush of drafts slithering through the chinks, the cabin now rested in a thick earthen hush. Every sound, the crackle of a log, the bubbling of a pot, felt warmer, fuller. Elias found himself sitting by the fire one evening, watching his family move through their small home without fear of the cold, and he realized something as profound as any revelation he'd had on the frontier. He hadn't just built warmth, he'd built peace. And on the frontier, peace was a rarer luxury than any firewood stack. Neighbors riding along the valley trail noticed it first. Not the volume of smoke itself, but the lack of it. Rowan's chimney, once a tower of constant gray plumes, now let off only a thin ribbon, faint and intermittent. On the frontier, a man could read another's troubles by the way his chimney smoked. Too much meant desperation, too many logs burning too little warmth. Too little meant the opposite, comfort. And comfort in a Montana winter was suspicious. Jed Harker was the first to stop by. He approached on a brittle morning boots, crunching over the crusted snow, pausing at the doorway, like he wasn't sure whether he was walking into a house or a giant mud sculpture. The cabin looked strange, up close. Solid, seamless, more earth than wood. Jed touched the exterior wall with 2 fingers, as if testing the hide of a strange animal. "Reckon it hasn't fallen apart yet," he said. Elias only smiled and stepped aside. When Jed entered the cabin, he froze mid-step. His eyes widened, and his breath caught not from cold, but because there wasn't any cold. The inside air was warm enough to fog his spectacles. A single small fire glowed in the stove, barely more than a cooking flame. Jed glanced at the hearth, then at the room, then at Elias. "This ain't natural," he whispered. "It's almost cozy." "You're welcome to sit if you want to find out why," Elias replied, offering a chair. Jed stayed for nearly an hour, running his hands along the walls, crouching near the floor, even climbing halfway up the loft ladder. He touched everything like a man trying to catch a trick being played on him. But there was no trick, only warmth, steady and even. Jed left without a joke, riding home with a crease of confusion carved across his forehead. Then came the McClearys, the Johnson boys, a trio of bachelor trappers. Each visitor arrived half out of ridicule, half out of curiosity. Each left silent and thoughtful. Word spread quickly, quiet, cautious, uncertain. "Rowan's mud-wrapped cabin feels different. He barely burns wood. It's warm even in the corners." Some settlers refused to believe what they heard. Others demanded explanations. Elias showed them the walls, the wattle frame, the mud mixture, the thickness. He spoke plainly, no grand claims, no boasting. He simply explained what earth does when you ask it to carry warmth instead of cold. Most nodded politely. A few scoffed outright. But some leaned in, asked questions, took notes. The first ripple had begun, and in a valley where cold killed livestock broke families and emptied cabins every winter, the possibility of a warmer home was more irresistible than anyone wanted to admit. By midwinter, something subtle but historic began happening across the valley. The Rowan cabin had become a quiet legend whispered about it over stew pots and on church steps, debated in the feed store and discussed under flickering lamplight in homes where families huddled close to weak fires. Warmth is a powerful persuader, and the idea that one cabin stood nearly 30 degrees warmer than all the rest spread faster than the cold itself. At first, the interest came from the weary and the desperate families whose own walls seeped cold like a sieve. The Thompson boys arrived one Sunday with a humble look of men ready to swallow pride. They circled the earthen-coated cabin, slowly pressing palms against the walls, tracing the layered texture with gloved fingers. The exterior was firm-dry and shockingly warm compared to the bitter air. "Feels like touching a sun-baked stone," one of them murmured. Next came the widowed Hammond woman, whose cabin had nearly frozen her out the previous winter. She didn't waste time with small talk. She stepped inside, closed her eyes, and simply breathed. A long, deep breath of warm air that didn't sting her lungs. "How much wood are you burning?" she asked. "Half what I cut last year," Elias answered. Her eyes glistened. Firewood for her wasn't just heat. It was survival labor and the constant risk of injury. As word grew, so did the desire to imitate the method. Men brought notebooks. Others carried handfuls of their own soil and clay to compare textures. A few tried to mix their first batches right outside Elias's door. One settler even arrived with a wheelbarrow full of river mud, asking Elias to judge the consistency. But imitation carried its own difficulties. Some experimented with more clay, creating coatings that dried too hard and cracked. Others added too much sand, resulting in mixtures that washed away in rain. A few, determined to improve on the Rowan method, introduced lime, which strengthened the coat, but made it heavier. One Swedish settler, Hans Bergstrom, incorporated techniques from home lime wash, finishing smoother troweling and color washing with natural pigments. His cabin ended up looking like a pale stone cottage dropped in the middle of Montana. It was no longer just a method. It had become a movement, each family adapting, revising, reinventing. By early spring, you could walk the valley and count more than a dozen cabins in various phases of transformation. Wooden homes encircled by willow frames, half-finished walls glistening with fresh coats of mud. Straw piles stacked outside like golden haystacks. The valley was beginning to look less like a cluster of frontier cabins and more like an experimental settlement of earth builders. What began as mockery had turned into curiosity, and curiosity was turning into action. The Rowan cabin had proven a truth the frontier often forgot. When survival is the reward, even the strangest idea can become the new wisdom. By the time spring crept cautiously back into the Bitterroot Valley, the transformation that began with one strange mud-coated cabin had already reshaped the rhythm of the entire settlement. The Rowan cabin wasn't just warmer, it had altered the very way people thought about winter survival and what a frontier home should be. And with that shift came consequences no one had anticipated. The first consequence was population stability. For years, the valley had bled families each winter. Some fled to town when the cold became unbearable. Others abandoned their homestead claims entirely, leaving behind half-finished cabins and fields choked with weeds. Winter, more than any other force, controlled who stayed and who left. But this year, something changed. Dozens of families who would have run for warmer shelter stayed. Some because they had already begun applying their own mud coatings. Others simply because Rowan's success sparked hope where resignation used to be. If his place can hold heat, they reasoned, maybe ours can too. Hope on the frontier was as valuable as firewood. The second consequence was winter mortality, or rather, the lack of it. When the valley tallied its winter losses, the numbers astonished even the toughest settlers. Fewer livestock froze. Fewer elderly fell ill from the cold. And among the children, those most vulnerable, nearly everyone survived the season. Warmth had become an equalizer, saving lives without anyone calling it heroism. A third consequence slipped in quietly. The valley's identity changed. Visitors riding through the Bitterroot began noticing the odd shapes of the cabins, rounded earth-toned, thicker than normal. They resembled primitive hill lodges or adobe houses far from their native lands. Some called it ugly, others called it ingenious. But no one forgot it. The community gained a reputation. That's the valley where folks mud coat their homes, laughable at first, then admirable, and eventually enviable. Then came the social shifts. Families who once kept to themselves began trading tips on mud mixtures, straw sources, drying times, and wattle weaving patterns. Barn raisings used to be the valley's main communal gathering. Now mud days became just as common. Children stomped clay with their feet. Women traded straw bundles. Men compared saplings for wattle frames. What started as one man's solitary experiment had grown into a shared craft. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence was the change in confidence. Settlers who survived the winter comfortably suddenly believed they could survive more. Build more, stay longer. The valley no longer felt like a temporary claim to prove up. It felt like home, and all because one man had dared to think differently and let his cabin look foolish for a season. Years passed before anyone tried to explain Elias Rowan's mud-coated cabin with the precision of science. At the time, settlers only knew one thing: the cabin stayed warm. But generations later, when historians, engineers, and natural building experts studied frontier structures, they found that Rowan's strange idea wasn't strange at all. It was physics in its purest, most elegant form. Modern thermal analysis begins with a number the frontier never used: R value, the measure of a material's resistance to heat flow. A standard log wall 10 inches thick offers roughly R1.5 to R2. In other words, almost no insulation at all. Logs are dense, fibrous, and continuous, perfect conductors for cold. But a packed mix of clay soil and straw, that's different. Testing shows that a 6-inch layer of earth and straw plaster can provide anywhere from R11 to R16, depending on density and moisture content. That's as effective as many modern fiberglass bats and far better than any wall a frontier settler could have built with timber alone. Yet insulation R value is only the beginning. Modern engineers also highlight thermal mass, a property Earth possesses in abundance. Thermal mass does not block temperature change, it slows it. It stores warmth like a battery and releases it, gradually smoothing out the violent temperature swings of mountain winters. Where logs surrendered their heat quickly, the mud layer absorbed the cabin's warmth during the day and returned it slowly through the night. Then there's the factor frontier men understood only through intuition: air infiltration. Drafts were the silent killers of cabin warmth. Even a dozen hairline gaps in the chinking could drain heat faster than a roaring fire could replace it. But when Rowan plastered the exterior with mud, those invisible pathways sealed shut. The cabin became, for the first time, nearly airtight. And one more overlooked advantage emerged: surface radiation. Bare logs radiate cold inward like a sheet of ice, pulling warmth from the room. But the earthen coat created a thick, non-conductive buffer that prevented radiative heat loss from ever reaching the cabin's interior. 3 problems: conduction, convection, radiation, solved with one layer of earth. What modern engineers now call continuous exterior insulation, Elias Rowan discovered by watching how root cellars and earthen lodges held steady through winter. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It was applied science frontier, science learned not from textbooks, but from the land itself. Rowan didn't know the equations. He didn't need to. He understood something deeper. When you listen to the earth, it tells you how to survive. Long after the mud had dried, long after the cabin proved its worth through storm after storm, Elias Rowan found himself thinking less about heat and more about meaning. A warm cabin was a blessing, but the lesson behind it ran deeper than comfort or survival. It touched something older, quieter, and far more human. The frontier had always rewarded strength, strong backs, strong wills, strong rifles, strong horses. Yet the older Elias became, the more he understood that strength alone never saved anyone. Winter didn't care how tough a man was. Hunger didn't respect pride. Cold punished stubbornness as harshly as it punished weakness. What saved people, truly saved them, was adaptation. The willingness to see the world as it was not, as tradition insisted it should be. Elias thought often about the men who mocked him, men who saw mud as foolish ugly beneath them. They weren't bad men, just prisoners of the old ways. They clung to the familiar because the familiar had gotten them this far. But the frontier was never conquered by familiarity. Every cabin, every road, every mile pushed westward existed because someone somewhere dared to try something that hadn't been tried before. His mud walls became a reminder of that truth, not a monument to cleverness, but a symbol of humility. A man who is humble enough to change can survive almost anything. Even the cabin itself seemed to whisper lessons. Wrapped in earth, it felt less like a structure imposed on the land, and more like something that had grown from it, belonging instead of resisting. The warmth inside felt earned, not forced. Elias found a kind of peace in that idea, that homes should work with the land, not against it. He also noticed something else, something subtle yet powerful. People who visited the warm cabin didn't leave talking only about insulation. They left talking about possibilities, about what else could be improved, rethought, reshaped. His experiment had unlocked a part of the frontier spirit that many had forgotten, the part that wasn't just tough, but curious. Sintani once said to his eldest boy, "It isn't about brute force. It's about seeing what others overlook, and having the courage to look foolish while you try it." That became the true philosophy of the warm wall. Sometimes the smartest idea wears the ugliest face. Sometimes survival demands that you unlearn. Sometimes wisdom sounds like madness right up until the moment it works. And on a land where winter could humble even the strongest men, that philosophy was worth more than any stack of firewood. As the years rolled on, the Bitterroot Valley slowly shed its reputation as a place where winters broke families. By the mid-1880s, travelers who rode through the region noticed something striking. Cabins didn't all look the same anymore. Some bore the classic log and chink style brought from the east. But more and more stood with broad shoulders of earth-rounded walls, thick frames, doorways, tucked deep into clay, like the entrances of ancient lodges. These were the descendants of the Rowan cabin, and every one of them had a story. Word of the technique traveled far beyond the valley. Ranch hands carried it north into British Columbia. Homesteaders packed it westward toward Idaho. Wagon trains heading into the Wyoming basin brought tales of a man who wrapped his house in mud and beat the winter. Even traders along the Columbia River mentioned it in passing, as if discussing a new trap design or a better way to patch a saddle. The idea spread the way frontier knowledge always did, quietly, humbly shared over campfires and under starlit porches. There was no formal manual, no blueprint. Each builder took what Rowan had done and molded the technique to their own land soil and climate. Some created smoother sand-rich coats. Others layered in volcanic ash to make the walls lighter and more insulating. A few settlements even built cabins with dual wall systems, a classic log structure wrapped in a second shell of earth with a 2-inch air gap in between. What had begun as ridicule evolved into a regional craft and finally a tradition. Meanwhile, Rowan's own family grew and prospered. His children inherited more than land or tools, they inherited understanding. They grew up warm, healthy, and unafraid of the long Montana winters. When they built homes of their own, they didn't copy their father's cabin blindly. They improved it. Wider eaves, better drainage slopes. Thicker coats on the north walls, thinner on the south. Strategic window placement to capture winter sunlight. Even small stone skirts at the base to keep runoff from eroding the earthen layers. These weren't just structures. They were lessons, physical embodiments of the idea that innovation and tradition can coexist. By the early 20th century, some of the original mud-coated cabins still stood weathered, cracked in places, but remarkably intact. A few were dismantled for lumber, and when the earth layers were removed, people found the logs beneath preserved better than expected, shielded for decades from wind and moisture. Museums collected samples, historians took notes, but the true legacy lived elsewhere. It lived in the mindset Rowan helped reignite, that a frontier home wasn't just a shelter from the cold, it was a conversation with the land, a negotiation, a partnership, and that sometimes the answers to the hardest problems weren't new at all. They were ancient, waiting to be remembered. By the time Elias Rowan reached his later years, the cabin that once drew laughter had become a quiet monument, unassuming, sturdy, and undeniably wise. Visitors would pass by and nod, with a kind of respect usually reserved for weathered barns or old cottonwoods that had survived lightning strikes. The earthen skin had been patched and renewed over the seasons, but the spirit of the original idea remained. A man had looked at the cold and refused to bow. On long winter evenings, Elias often sat by the fire, no longer out of necessity, but out of ritual. The warmth around him wasn't the frantic heat of a raging blaze, but a gentle, even breath held by the earth-packed walls. His grandchildren would gather at his feet listening as he told them the story, not as triumph, but as lesson. People laughed, he would say, because they saw mud where they expected logs. But the land knows things we forget. If you listen long enough, it tells you. What he never framed as pride, others later described as genius. What neighbors once dismissed as foolishness slowly became the standard for an entire region. What began as one man's stubborn experiment turned into generational knowledge, integrated into building styles, family lore, and the practical memory of places shaped by harsh winters. Even after Elias passed, the idea he'd revived kept spreading. Settlers in distant territories coated their cabins. Newly built homes incorporated thick exterior plaster as an expected feature rather than an oddity. Natural building movements a century later cited techniques just like Rowan's as examples of vernacular brilliant solutions, born not from advanced schooling, but from necessity perception and courage. Historians studying the Bitterroot Valley eventually noted something unusual about the population records from Rowan's era. Families stayed. Children survived. Homesteads succeeded at higher rates than similar settlements in equally harsh climates. A simple, crude-looking mud layer had shifted the balance between suffering and comfort, between endurance and genuine livability. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the warm wall wasn't thermal at all. It was philosophical. Rowan had reminded people then and now that innovation doesn't demand prestige. Resilience doesn't require refinement. Wisdom doesn't need to look pretty. Sometimes the truth arrives covered in dirt, shaped by the hands of a man willing to kneel in the mud and try something no one else dared. On the frontier, survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. And the man who coated his cabin in 6 inches of earth embodied that truth more clearly than any academic ever could. The valley never forgot him. And every winter, when frost crawled across the windows of newer homes built with thicker walls and smarter insulation, someone would quietly say, "It all started with that one cabin," the one they laughed at.